The scream came from the west field, and Lyra Ashwood was already running before she understood why. She had been standing near the old stone well behind her father's house, holding a folded letter that still smelled of ink, when the sound cut through the quiet morning air. Birds scattered from the trees. Somewhere behind her, a door slammed. She did not stop to think. She dropped the letter and ran toward the noise, her bare feet slapping against the cold, dew-covered grass. By the time she reached the field, 3 men were already standing over her father's fallen body. He was not moving. His chest, usually so steady and calm, did not rise. Lyra fell to her knees beside him, her hands shaking as she reached for his face. "Father," she whispered. "Father, please." There was no answer. There would never be an answer again. The pack healer arrived minutes later, though it made no difference. Beta Alden Ashwood, the man who had led the border patrols for 22 years, who had raised his daughter alone since her mother's passing, who had promised Lyra only the night before that everything would be fine, was gone. A heart that had carried the weight of an entire pack for decades had simply stopped. Lyra did not cry that day. She could not. Grief sat inside her chest like a stone too heavy to lift, and she moved through the following hours as though she were watching someone else live her life. She barely noticed the pack members who came to offer condolences. She barely noticed the arrangements being made around her. The only thing she noticed, though she would not understand its importance until much later, was the way Draven held her hand a little too tightly at the funeral, his eyes drifting toward the horizon instead of toward her father's grave. Draven Cole had been her mate for almost 2 years. Their bond had formed suddenly, the way many wolf bonds did, in a heartbeat, during a pack gathering, when their eyes had met across a crowded hall. Since that night, Lyra had believed, with the simple faith of someone who had never been given a reason to doubt, that Draven loved her completely. He was strong, respected among the younger enforcers, and quick to smile whenever she entered a room. Her father had approved of him, cautiously, the way fathers often approve of the men who take their daughters' hearts. "He is ambitious," her father had told her once, watching Draven train in the yard below their porch. "Ambition is not a bad thing, Lyra, but watch how a man carries it. Some men carry ambition like a tool, others carry it like a hunger that is never satisfied." At the time, she had laughed and told her father he worried too much. Now, standing at the edge of a freshly dug grave with Draven's arm around her shoulders, she wished she had asked him what he meant. The days after the funeral passed in a blur of visitors, documents, and quiet condolences. It was on the 7th day, when the house had finally emptied of mourners, that a formal messenger arrived from the pack's council chamber. He carried a sealed envelope bearing the crest of the Ashwood line, along with a thick stack of papers that Lyra did not yet understand the weight of. "Your father's will," the messenger explained, setting the papers gently on the kitchen table. "As his only living heir, everything passes to you, the house, his savings, and—" He paused, glancing toward the window that faced the distant tree line. "The western borderland." Lyra frowned. "The western borderland? That's just forest. It's been empty for as long as I can remember." The messenger's expression flickered, just for a moment, with something that looked almost like unease. "It is more than forest, Miss Ashwood. That land has been in your family's care for 3 generations. It sits along the old boundary line, the one the elders speak of in the founding stories. Some say the ground itself carries old magic, tied to the earliest packs. Whether or not that is true, the land is valuable, very valuable. Mining scouts and timber merchants have already inquired about it more than once over the years, though your father always refused to sell." After the messenger left, Lyra sat alone at the table for a long time, staring at the papers without truly reading them. She did not care about magic or old boundary lines. She cared that her father was gone, and that she now held, in her shaking hands, the last piece of him that remained. It was Draven who found her there an hour later, the papers still spread before her. "You should not be alone with all this," he said, sitting across from her and taking her hand. His thumb traced slow circles over her knuckles, a gesture that had once comforted her. "Let me help you go through it." She nodded, grateful, and pushed the stack toward him. He read through the documents with unusual focus, his eyes moving quickly across each page, lingering longest on the section describing the western borderland's exact measurements and its listed value. "This is a lot of land," he said quietly, almost to himself. "I suppose so," Lyra said, too tired to think much of it. "I don't know what I'll do with it. Maybe I'll just let it be, the way Father did." Draven looked up at her then, and for a brief instant, something crossed his face that she could not name. It was gone as quickly as it appeared, replaced by his familiar warm smile. "Of course," he said. "Whatever you decide, I only want what is best for you." She believed him completely. In the weeks that followed, life slowly began to take a new shape. Lyra returned to her small duties within the pack, helping the healer prepare herbal remedies, tending to the garden her mother had once kept, trying to find comfort in routine. Draven remained close, visiting nearly every evening, sitting with her by the fire, telling her stories to make her laugh, when grief threatened to pull her under again. She clung to those moments like a lifeline. But slowly, almost too slowly to notice, small things began to shift. It started with the maps. Lyra found Draven one afternoon in her father's old study, bent over a set of old surveying maps that outlined the western borderland in careful detail. He explained, when she asked, that he was simply curious about the property now that it belonged to her, that he wanted to understand what she had inherited, so he could help her manage it properly. His explanation made sense. She thanked him for caring so much, and thought nothing more of it. Then came the visits from Beta Corwin, the pack's second-in-command, a tall, sharp-eyed man who had never shown much interest in Lyra before her father's death. Now he seemed to appear whenever Draven was present, the two of them speaking in low voices that stopped whenever Lyra entered the room. When she asked what they discussed, Draven waved it off as pack business, matters too dull to bother her with during her time of mourning. She wanted, more than anything, to believe him. One evening, nearly a month after the funeral, Lyra woke suddenly from a light sleep, her heart pounding for reasons she could not explain. The mate bond, the invisible thread that connected her to Draven, felt strange, distant, as though someone had turned down its warmth like the flame of a dying candle. She lay in the darkness, staring at the ceiling, trying to convince herself it was only grief still working its way through her chest. But the feeling did not fade. If anything, it grew stronger with each passing day. Draven's visits became less frequent. When he did come, his smiles seemed practiced rather than genuine, his eyes sometimes drifting toward the window, toward the direction of the western borderland, as though calculating something he did not wish to share. Lyra told herself it was nothing. She told herself grief made people strange, made bonds feel fragile even when they were not. She told herself many things during those quiet, uncertain weeks, because the alternative, the possibility that the man she loved was slipping away from her for reasons she could not understand, was too frightening to face directly. She did not yet know that her instincts, the quiet unease curling in her stomach every time Draven mentioned her land, were trying to warn her of something far worse than a fading bond. She did not yet know that the western borderland was not merely valuable. It was the key to everything Draven wanted, and she was, without realizing it, the only obstacle standing between him and that power. The autumn air grew colder as the weeks passed, the leaves along the western tree line turning gold and then brown, falling one by one onto the quiet, undisturbed ground that Lyra had still never bothered to visit. She had grown up hearing stories about that land, vague warnings from her father about staying away from the old boundary markers, about respecting ground that belonged to older laws than the pack's current council. She had always assumed his caution was simply superstition, the kind of old belief that faded with each passing generation. Now, sitting in her father's empty study late one night, surrounded by his books and papers, she found herself wondering for the first time whether his caution had been something else entirely, whether he had known something about that land, something important enough that he refused every offer to sell it, no matter how much money was placed in front of him. She pulled open one of his desk drawers, searching without quite knowing what she hoped to find, and her fingers brushed against a small, worn journal tucked beneath a stack of old letters. The leather cover was cracked with age, and when she opened it, she found her father's familiar handwriting filling page after page. Most entries were mundane, notes about patrol schedules, weather patterns, small disputes between pack members that needed his attention. But near the back of the journal, The entries changed. The handwriting grew tighter, more hurried, as though written in secret or in haste. The land holds more than soil, one entry read. I have felt it beneath my feet during patrols. A pull I cannot explain, like the earth itself is aware of something ancient stirring beneath it. I will not speak of this to the council. Not yet. Not until I understand what it means, and what it could mean for Lyra, should anything happen to me. Her hands trembled as she turned the page. If anyone comes asking about the western boundary, watch them carefully. Watch how their eyes change when they speak of it. Power draws certain kinds of men the way blood draws certain kinds of wolves. I fear I already know who among us carries that hunger. There was no name written after that final line, only a small, hurried sketch of the boundary markers, and beside it, a single word underlined twice. Careful. Lyra closed the journal slowly, her heart pounding in her chest. Outside, the wind moved through the bare trees, and somewhere in the distance, she heard the low, familiar howl of a patrol shift changing hands. She thought of her father's warning, of the strange coldness that had settled over her bond with Draven in recent weeks, of the maps she had found him studying with such quiet intensity. She told herself, once again, that she was imagining connections that did not exist. But deep down, in the part of her that had inherited her father's careful instincts, a small and persistent voice had already begun to whisper the truth she was not yet ready to hear. Someone close to her wanted that land more than they wanted her. And she was about to discover exactly how far that hunger would carry them. 3 weeks after Lyra found her father's journal, the first true crack in her bond with Draven appeared, and it came not from suspicion, but from something she overheard entirely by accident. She had gone to the pack hall that evening to deliver a basket of herbs to the healer, a small errand that should have taken only a few minutes. The hallways were mostly empty at that hour, the council members having already retired for the night, their meetings long finished. Lyra moved quietly through the corridor, her footsteps soft against the stone floor, when she heard voices coming from the small side room, usually reserved for private council discussions. She recognized Draven's voice immediately. The second voice belonged to Beta Corwin. She should have kept walking, she told herself that later, many times, wondering what might have been different had she simply continued on her way and pretended she heard nothing. But something in Draven's tone, low and urgent, in a way she had never heard him speak before, made her pause just outside the door. The council will not approve a claim without proper reasoning, Corwin was saying. You cannot simply request the western land be transferred to your name. There must be a legal path. There is a path, Draven answered. If something happens to her, the land passes automatically to her surviving mate. That is pack law, unchanged for generations. I do not need the council's approval if I am already her mate when it happens. Lyra's breath caught in her throat. And if she has children first? Corwin asked, or if the council questions the timing. She has no children, Draven said, his voice flat, almost bored, as though discussing something as simple as the weather. And there will be nothing to question if it looks like an accident. Patrols along the western boundary are dangerous this time of year. Wolves have died there before, from falls, from creatures that wander too close to the old markers. No one will think twice if she does not return from a routine walk. The floor seemed to tilt beneath Lyra's feet. She pressed her hand against the cold stone wall to keep herself steady, her mind refusing at first to fully process what she had just heard. Surely she had misunderstood. Surely there was some explanation, some context she was missing, that would make those words mean something other than what they so plainly seemed to mean. But Corwin's next words left no room for misunderstanding. The ley line beneath that land is worth more than you realize, he said. If what the old texts suggest is true, whoever holds that ground when the veil grows thin during the coming season could command more than territory. We could reshape the entire balance of power among the northern packs. This is bigger than land, Draven. This is bigger than either of us. I know exactly what it is, Draven said. That is why I am not going to hesitate. Lyra did not remember deciding to move. One moment she was frozen against the wall, and the next she was walking, then running, back down the corridor, out through the side entrance of the pack hall, into the cold night air. Her lungs burned, her vision blurred with tears she refused to let fall. Everything she had believed about the man she loved, about the future she had imagined for herself, crumbled apart in the space of a few overheard sentences. She did not go home that night. She could not bear the thought of sitting in the same house where Draven might soon arrive, smiling at her the way he always did, his hands gentle, his voice warm, while beneath that gentleness, he was quietly planning her death. Instead, she walked to the edge of the training grounds and sat beneath an old oak tree, wrapping her arms around her knees, trying to think clearly despite the storm raging inside her chest. She thought of her father's journal. Watch how their eyes change when they speak of it. She thought of every strange moment over the past weeks, every hushed conversation that stopped when she entered a room, every distant look in Draven's eyes when he thought she was not watching. All of it made a terrible kind of sense now. The mate bond, she realized, had not weakened because of grief or distance. It had weakened because Draven's feelings toward her had genuinely changed, replaced by a colder calculation she had been too trusting to notice sooner. By the time morning light broke over the horizon, Lyra had made her decision. She could not go to the council, not directly, not yet. Corwin was a beta, deeply respected, his word carrying weight that hers, a grieving young woman with no formal standing beyond her inheritance, could not easily match. If she accused Draven without proof, she risked being dismissed, or worse, risked revealing that she knew, which would only make whatever plan they had move faster. She needed proof, or she needed to disappear before that plan could be carried out. For the next several days, Lyra played the part of a woman who suspected nothing. It was the hardest performance of her life. She smiled when Draven visited. She let him hold her hand by the fire, though every touch now made her stomach twist with quiet horror. She listened to him speak of ordinary things, the upcoming harvest festival, a friend's upcoming wedding, all while knowing that somewhere behind his calm expression, he was waiting for the right moment to end her life. She began, quietly, to prepare. She gathered a small amount of dried food and stored it in a hidden pouch beneath a loose floorboard in her bedroom. She studied her father's old maps, memorizing paths through the forest that avoided the main patrol routes. She practiced walking silently, the way her father had once taught her as a child, back when such lessons had felt like nothing more than a game between father and daughter. Most importantly, she watched. She watched Draven's schedule shift subtly, noticed him volunteering more frequently for western boundary patrols, always requesting to go alone, or with only Corwin at his side. She noticed new visitors arriving at the pack hall, strangers who spoke quietly with Corwin and left just as quietly, their faces unfamiliar, their purpose unclear. One night, unable to bear the tension any longer, Lyra decided to follow Draven when he left for what he claimed was a routine evening patrol. She kept her distance, moving through the trees with careful, silent steps, her heart hammering against her ribs with every crack of a twig beneath her feet. She found him standing near the old boundary markers her father's journal had warned her about, speaking not with Corwin this time, but with a woman Lyra did not recognize, dressed in dark, unfamiliar clothing that marked her as someone from outside the pack entirely. The ceremony must happen before the season turns, the stranger was saying. If the land's true heir dies before the veil thins, the power transfers cleanly to whoever holds the mate bond, but it must happen soon. The window will not stay open long. It will happen soon, Draven answered. I only need the right moment, one that raises no suspicion. Lyra pressed her hand against her mouth to keep from making a sound. She had heard enough, more than enough. There was no more room for doubt, no comforting explanation waiting to reveal itself. The man she had trusted with her heart, the man her own father had cautiously approved of, was actively planning to end her life for the power hidden beneath her family's land, and he was not acting alone. She turned and made her way back through the trees as quickly and quietly as she could manage, her mind racing through every possibility, every option available to a young woman suddenly hunted by the very people meant to protect her. She could not go to the pack council. Corwin's influence ran too deep, and she had no proof beyond her own testimony, easily dismissed as grief-driven paranoia. She could not confront Draven directly, not without risking her life the moment he realized she knew the truth. She could not simply wait and hope the danger would pass, not when she had just heard, with her own ears, that the danger was coming soon. There was only one path left open to her, one option that offered even a small chance of survival. She had to run. Tonight, before Draven realized she had followed him. Before the season turned, and the window he spoke of closed, forcing his hand. She had to disappear into the unknown, leaving behind everything she had ever known, trusting nothing but her own instincts and the careful lessons her father had left scattered throughout his journal. Lessons she now understood had been meant to prepare her for exactly this moment. As she crept back toward her home under the cover of darkness, gathering the small pouch of supplies she had hidden beneath the floorboard, Lyra allowed herself one final, painful thought. Somewhere out there, beyond the borders of everything familiar, she would need to find not just safety, but answers. Answers about her father's warnings. Answers about the land itself, and the strange power that seemed to make so many people willing to kill for it. She did not yet know that those answers waited far beyond her own pack's borders, in the hands of a king she had never met, whose own bloodline was tied to her family's secrets, in ways she could not possibly imagine. All she knew, as she slipped out into the cold night air one final time, was that she had to survive long enough to find out. The night Lyra ran was colder than she expected, the kind of cold that settled deep into her bones and made every breath visible in the moonlight. She moved quickly through the forest behind her house, avoiding the main paths, following instead the narrow deer trails her father had shown her as a child, back when their walks through these woods had been about nothing more than teaching her patience and the names of birds. She carried little: the small pouch of dried food, a water skin, a warm cloak, and her father's journal tucked carefully against her chest, wrapped in cloth to keep it safe from the damp night air. Everything else, her home, her memories, the life she had built around a bond she now understood had been built on lies, she left behind without looking back. She did not run blindly. She had spent the previous days memorizing her father's old maps, tracing possible routes with her finger, long after the candle beside her bed had burned low. She knew the western boundary was watched too closely now to risk crossing there, so instead, she turned north, toward unfamiliar territory that no one would expect her to choose. If Draven searched for her, and she had no doubt that he eventually would, he would look toward the places she knew, the places that made sense. She intended to disappear into the places that did not. The first night passed in a blur of exhaustion and fear. She did not stop moving until the sky began to lighten with the first hints of dawn, and even then, she allowed herself only a short rest beneath the roots of a fallen tree, curled tightly against the cold, listening for any sound that might mean she had been followed. None came, but the silence brought little comfort. She knew Draven would not raise an alarm immediately. A missing mate might draw questions he was not yet ready to answer. He would search quietly at first, using trusted allies rather than the full pack, hoping to find her and correct the situation before anyone else noticed she was gone. That quiet search, Lyra realized as she pressed onward through the second day, might actually work in her favor. It meant she had time, not much, but some, before her disappearance became something the entire pack would actively hunt. By the third day, hunger had become a constant gnawing presence, and her supplies had already begun to dwindle faster than she had planned. She had never truly been alone in the wilderness before, not like this, not without the safety net of a pack surrounding her. Every sound made her flinch. Every shadow between the trees seemed, for a heartbeat, to take the shape of someone hunting her. She pushed through the fear, the way her father had once taught her to push through pain during training, one careful step at a time, refusing to let her mind wander too far into the dangers that might be waiting ahead. She drank from clean streams when she found them. She ate what little she had left in small, careful portions. She slept in short bursts, always alert, always listening. On the fifth night, exhaustion finally began to win the battle her willpower had been fighting since she left home. Her legs trembled with every step, her thoughts grew slow and heavy, the kind of tiredness that made even simple decisions feel impossibly difficult. She knew, somewhere in the back of her mind, that she needed to rest properly soon, or her body would eventually force the decision for her. It was during this exhausted, vulnerable state that she first felt it, a strange, prickling awareness at the base of her neck, the kind of feeling that every wolf learned to recognize early in life. She was being watched. Lyra froze mid-step, her heart slamming against her ribs. She scanned the tree line slowly, careful not to make any sudden movement that might reveal how afraid she truly was. For a long moment, she saw nothing but shadows and swaying branches. Then, near a cluster of thick undergrowth, she caught the faint outline of eyes reflecting the dim moonlight. Not human eyes. Not wolf eyes she recognized either. She did not wait to find out what creature watched her from the darkness. She turned and ran, pushing her exhausted body past its limits, branches tearing at her cloak, roots threatening to trip her with every desperate stride. She did not know how long she ran before the sound of pursuit, heavy footsteps crashing through the undergrowth behind her, confirmed that whatever had been watching her was no longer simply watching. She burst through a final line of trees and found herself at the edge of a wide, unfamiliar river, its dark water rushing swiftly beneath the moonlight. There was no time to search for another path. The footsteps behind her grew louder, closer, and with no other option remaining, Lyra threw herself into the freezing water. The cold hit her like a physical blow, stealing the breath from her lungs and numbing her limbs almost instantly. The current pulled at her, stronger than she had anticipated, dragging her downstream despite her efforts to swim toward the far bank. She fought against it with whatever strength remained in her exhausted body, her arms burning, her lungs screaming for air she could not fully catch between the icy waves crashing over her head. She did not know how long the river carried her before her body finally gave out, her strength failing completely as darkness crept into the edges of her vision. Her last conscious thought, as the current pulled her beneath the surface one final time, was a quiet, desperate hope that whatever waited for her beyond the darkness would be kinder than what she had left behind. When Lyra opened her eyes again, she was lying on a rocky riverbank, coughing violently as water forced its way out of her lungs. Every part of her body ached with a deep, bruising pain, and her vision swam in and out of focus as she struggled to understand how she had survived and where the river had finally released her. She had no memory of pulling herself from the water. She only knew that somehow, against every reasonable expectation, she was alive. The land around her looked different from anything she had passed through before, the trees taller, older, arranged in patterns that felt almost deliberate, as though something had shaped this forest with careful intention long ago. Strange markings, faint and weathered, were carved into some of the larger trunks nearby, symbols she did not recognize, but that stirred a distant, unsettling familiarity somewhere deep in her memory. She forced herself to sit up, despite the protest of every muscle in her body, wrapping her arms around herself against the lingering cold. Her supplies were gone, swept away by the river along with her water skin and the last of her dried food. Only her father's journal remained, still miraculously secured against her chest beneath her soaked cloak, the cloth wrapping having protected it just enough to keep the pages from ruining completely. She had no food. No clean water nearby that she could see, no sense of exactly where she was, or how far the river had carried her from her original path, and somewhere behind her, whatever creature had chased her toward the water might still be searching, along with the very real possibility that Draven's search parties had expanded their range in the days since her disappearance. Despite everything, despite the exhaustion and fear and uncertainty pressing down on her from every direction, Lyra allowed herself a single, fragile moment of relief. She was alive. She had survived the river, survived whatever had hunted her through the trees, survived 5 days of running with nothing but instinct and her father's careful lessons to guide her. She did not yet know that survival, though it felt like an ending in that exhausted, aching moment on the riverbank, was only the beginning of a much larger journey. The land she had washed ashore upon did not belong to any pack she recognized. It belonged, though she could not have known it yet, to territory watched closely by scouts loyal to a king, whose name was spoken with a mixture of respect and quiet fear across every pack in the region. Pulling herself unsteadily to her feet, Lyra took a deep, shaking breath and began to walk once more, following the only instinct she had left, the simple, stubborn will to keep moving forward, no matter how far from home that forward might lead her. She had no way of knowing that within a single day's journey, her path would collide with forces far larger than a single mate's betrayal, far larger than a single pack's ambitions. She had no way of knowing that the king whose lands she now unknowingly wandered through carried, within his own family's history, a secret that would eventually explain every strange warning her father had ever written, every hushed conversation she had overheard, every reason someone might want her dead simply for existing. All she knew, as she pushed forward through unfamiliar trees with nothing but stubborn will keeping her upright, was that she could not stop moving. Not yet. Not until she found somewhere, anywhere, safe enough to finally rest. By the 7th day since fleeing her home, Lyra had lost track of how far she had traveled. Hunger had become a constant companion, gnawing at her insides with a persistence that made clear thinking increasingly difficult. She survived on what little the forest offered, bitter berries she was not entirely certain were safe to eat, roots she dug from the cold earth with her bare hands, water from streams she could only hope were clean. Her body had grown thinner in ways she could feel beneath her worn cloak, her steps slower and less steady than they had been even a few days before. Still, she pushed forward, driven by the same stubborn instinct that had carried her through the river, through the long nights of fear and exhaustion, through every moment when giving up might have felt easier than continuing. The forest around her had changed gradually over the past 2 days, the trees growing taller and more ordered, the underbrush cleared in places that suggested deliberate maintenance rather than natural growth. She noticed, with a distant sort of curiosity that her exhausted mind could barely process, faint paths worn into the earth, evidence that this land was traveled regularly by someone, though she had not yet encountered another living soul. It was on the morning of the 8th day that her body finally reached its limit. She had been walking along a narrow ridge overlooking a wide valley, the morning sun casting pale golden light across trees she no longer had the strength to properly appreciate, when her legs simply stopped obeying her. One moment she was walking, and the next, the ground rushed up to meet her, her vision narrowing to a small, spinning point of light before fading into complete darkness. She did not know how long she lay there, unconscious on the cold ground, before the sound of approaching footsteps and low, urgent voices pulled her back toward awareness. She could not open her eyes. Her body refused every command her mind attempted to send it, leaving her trapped in a strange, floating state between consciousness and oblivion, aware of voices and movement around her, but unable to respond or fully understand what was happening. "She is barely breathing," a voice said, sharp with concern. "Get her to the healer immediately. She needs warmth and water before anything else." "She is not from our territory," another voice added, quieter, more cautious. "Her scent marks her as an outsider. The king will want to know immediately that someone crossed the border unnoticed." "That concern can wait," the first voice snapped. "She will die within the hour if we do not act quickly." Lyra felt herself being lifted, strong arms cradling her weakened body with surprising gentleness, despite the urgency in the voices around her. She wanted to speak, to explain, to ask where she was being taken, but exhaustion pulled her back under before she could manage even a single word. When she finally woke again, properly this time, she found herself lying on something soft and warm, a real bed, the first she had felt in over a week. Sunlight filtered through a nearby window, casting gentle patterns across a room that was simple, but clearly well cared for. Wooden furniture polished smooth, clean linens, the faint scent of herbs hanging pleasantly in the air. She tried to sit up, and immediately regretted it, as pain shot through muscles she had pushed far beyond their limits over the past week. A gentle hand pressed against her shoulder, guiding her back down against the pillows. "Slowly," a woman's voice said, kind but firm. "You have been through a great deal. Your body needs time to recover properly." Lyra turned her head weakly to find an older woman sitting beside the bed, her silver-streaked hair pulled back neatly, her eyes sharp with the kind of intelligence that came from years of tending to injuries far worse than exhaustion and hunger. A healer, Lyra realized, though not one she recognized. "Where am I?" Lyra managed to whisper, her throat dry and raw. "You are within the territory of the Thornbrook Pack," the woman answered, reaching for a cup of water on the small table beside the bed and helping Lyra drink slowly. "You collapsed near the eastern ridge, several miles inside our border. My name is Marin. I am the Pack's head healer. You have been unconscious for nearly 2 full days." 2 days? Lyra's mind struggled to process the information, fear rising sharply despite her exhaustion. If she had been unconscious for 2 days, That meant 2 full days had passed, during which Draven's search parties, wherever they had reached by now, might have drawn closer to finding her. 2 days during which she had been entirely vulnerable, entirely at the mercy of strangers whose intentions she could not yet judge. "I need to leave," she said, struggling weakly against the blankets, despite the way her body protested every movement. "I cannot stay here. It is not safe." "You are in no condition to go anywhere," Maren said firmly, pressing her back down once more, with surprising strength for someone her age. "And I would advise caution before assuming danger follows you here. This territory is well protected. Very few threats manage to cross our borders without being noticed immediately, which is precisely why your unexpected arrival has already drawn attention." Lyra's stomach tightened with a fresh wave of anxiety. Attention from whom? Before Maren could answer, the door to the small room opened, and a young man entered carrying a tray of simple food, warm broth and fresh bread, that made Lyra's stomach ache with sudden, desperate hunger despite her fear. He set the tray down carefully on the table before glancing toward Maren. "The king wishes to see her once she has eaten and regained enough strength to speak clearly," he said. "He has asked to be informed the moment she wakes." Lyra's breath caught in her throat. "The king?" Maren nodded, her expression unreadable. "Cale Thornbrook, Alpha King of these lands, and every territory bordering them for many miles in every direction. It is not common for him to take personal interest in a stranger found unconscious within his borders, but he has requested to see you himself, rather than leaving the matter to his council." Lyra had heard the name Thornbrook before, whispered occasionally among older pack members, with a tone that mixed respect with something closer to caution. The Thornbrook line was ancient, powerful, ruling over territory far larger than her own modest pack had ever controlled. She had never imagined, in all her life, that she might one day find herself lying in a bed within their walls, let alone summoned to speak with their king directly. Fear and exhaustion warred within her, but beneath both, a small, stubborn spark of hope flickered to life for the first time since she had fled her home. If this king truly held power and influence as vast as his reputation suggested, perhaps here, finally, she had found somewhere safe enough to catch her breath. Somewhere Draven's reach might not easily extend. She ate slowly, forcing down the warm broth despite her nervous stomach, allowing Maren to check her injuries and confirm that, while exhausted and malnourished, she had suffered no lasting harm from her journey. As strength slowly returned to her limbs, Lyra found herself thinking again of her father's journal, of his warnings about power and hunger, and the strange pull he had described feeling beneath the western borderland. She wondered, as Maren helped her into simple, clean clothing and prepared to guide her toward wherever the king waited, whether the answers to those warnings might finally be within her reach. Whether this powerful stranger, ruler of lands she had never before set foot upon, might somehow hold pieces of a puzzle that had begun the moment her father closed his eyes for the final time. She had no way of knowing, as she followed Maren through unfamiliar stone corridors toward her first meeting with the Alpha King, that the answers waiting for her went far beyond anything she could have imagined. She had no way of knowing that the man she was about to meet would soon become the single most important figure in the fight for her survival, and that his own family's history was tied, in ways neither of them yet understood, to the very land Draven had tried to kill her for. All she knew, as the heavy wooden doors ahead of her slowly opened, revealing a grand hall bathed in warm afternoon light, was that her journey, far from ending here, was only just beginning. The great hall of the Thornbrook stronghold was larger than anything Lyra had ever stood inside, its high stone ceilings supported by thick wooden beams carved with symbols similar to the ones she had noticed on the trees near the river days before. Sunlight poured through tall windows along one side of the hall, illuminating dust motes that drifted lazily through the air, giving the entire space a strange, almost dreamlike quality that made Lyra's still recovering mind struggle to fully process where she stood. At the far end of the hall, seated not on an elaborate throne as she had half expected, but on a simple, sturdy wooden chair positioned before a large table covered in maps and documents, sat the man Maren had spoken of. Cale Thornbrook did not look up immediately as Lyra approached, his attention focused on the papers before him, though something in the way his shoulders shifted suggested he was fully aware of her presence the moment she entered the room. When he finally raised his eyes to meet hers, Lyra felt an unexpected jolt run through her chest, though not the warm recognition she had once felt upon meeting Draven. This felt different, sharper, more like the sudden awareness of standing near something vast and powerful that could, with very little effort, decide her fate entirely. Chaol was younger than she had expected, though his eyes carried a weight and seriousness that suggested years of responsibility far beyond his age. His dark hair was pulled back neatly, his posture straight and commanding, even while seated, and though his expression remained carefully neutral, she noticed the way his gaze studied her closely, almost searching for something specific, rather than simply assessing a stranger who had wandered uninvited into his territory. "You are the woman found near the eastern ridge," he said, his voice calm, but carrying an unmistakable authority that filled the entire hall despite its quiet tone. It was not quite a question. "Yes," Lyra answered, forcing her voice to remain steady, despite the nervous tremor she felt beneath her ribs. "My name is Lyra Ashwood. I apologize for crossing your territory without permission. I did not intend to trespass. I was—" She hesitated, uncertain how much to reveal to a stranger holding this much power over her immediate safety. "Running," Chaol finished for her, his eyes narrowing slightly. "From what exactly?" Lyra's throat tightened. She had spent days considering how she might explain her situation if given the chance. Yet standing here now, faced with the reality of the king's sharp, assessing gaze, every carefully rehearsed explanation seemed to scatter from her mind entirely. "From my mate," she said finally, deciding that honesty, however dangerous it might feel, was likely her safest option. "He intended to end my life, for my inheritance, land that belonged to my family for generations." Something shifted in Chaol's expression at her words, subtle but unmistakable, a flicker of sharp interest that replaced the careful neutrality he had maintained until that moment. He leaned forward slightly, his attention now fully, intensely focused on her. "What land?" he asked. "The western borderland of my former pack's territory," Lyra answered, confused by the sudden intensity of his interest. "It has been in my family for 3 generations, though I never understood why it mattered so much to anyone until recently. My mate and his ally spoke of some kind of power tied to the land. A ley line, they called it. Something about a veil thinning during this season." Chaol rose slowly from his chair, and Lyra found herself instinctively taking a small step backward, though nothing in his movement suggested threat, only a restless energy that seemed to fill the space around him, as he began pacing slowly near the table. "What is your father's name?" he asked, his voice tighter now, carrying an urgency that had not been present moments before. "Alden," Lyra answered. "Alden Ashwood. He passed away several weeks ago. He was beta of our pack for over 20 years. Chaol stopped pacing abruptly, turning to look at her with an expression she could not quite interpret, something between disbelief and grim recognition. "Alden Ashwood," he repeated quietly, almost to himself. "I had heard that name mentioned once, many years ago, though I never expected to hear it again, and certainly never expected his daughter to arrive at my border, half drowned and running for her life." "You knew my father?" Lyra asked, her heart quickening with a confusing mixture of hope and fear. "Not personally," Chaol admitted, "but his name appears in records far older than either of us, records tied closely to my own family's history. I need to review those documents again before I say anything further. What you have told me raises questions I am not yet prepared to answer, though I suspect the answers, once found, will explain a great deal more than simply why your mate wanted you dead." Lyra's mind raced, questions multiplying faster than she could organize them into coherent thought. What could possibly connect her quiet, modest family to the ancient and powerful Thornbrook line? What records could Chaol possibly hold that mentioned her father by name? "Please," she said, her voice cracking slightly, despite her effort to remain composed. "I do not understand any of this. My father left warnings in a journal before he died, about power hidden beneath our land, about someone I should be careful of. He never explained what he meant. I have been running for 8 days with nothing but questions and no answers. If you know something, anything, I need you to tell me." Chaol studied her for a long moment, his expression softening slightly as he seemed to truly register, perhaps for the first time, not just the political implications of her arrival, but the simple, human exhaustion and fear evident in her voice and posture. "You are still recovering," he said finally, his tone gentler than before, though still carrying the natural authority of someone accustomed to command. "I will not burden you with speculation before I have proper answers to give. For now, you have my word that you will remain safe within these walls. No one will harm you here, and no one from your former pack will be permitted to remove you from my territory without my direct approval." "Why?" Lyra asked, unable to fully mask her suspicion, despite the relief his words offered. "Why would you offer protection to a stranger you have only just met?" Cale's expression grew serious once more, his eyes holding hers with an intensity that made her breath catch unexpectedly. "Because I believe, Lyra Ashwood, that you are far more important than you currently realize. And because, if what I suspect about your father's warnings proves true, the danger you are running from extends far beyond a single ambitious mate seeking your inheritance. It may extend to threats that concern every pack within these lands, myself included." Before Lyra could press him further, the hall's heavy doors opened once more, and a breathless guard entered, his expression tense with urgent news. "My king," he said, bowing quickly before continuing. "Riders have arrived at the northern border. They claim to be searching for a missing pack member and request permission to search our territory. Their leader gives his name as Draven Cole." The color drained from Lyra's face immediately, her legs suddenly threatening to give out beneath her, despite Marin's earlier care in restoring her strength. Cale's gaze shifted toward her instantly, taking in her reaction, understanding immediately, without need for further explanation. "He found me," Lyra whispered, horror creeping through her chest like ice water. "He knows I am here." Cale's expression hardened, the warmth he had briefly shown replaced by something colder, sharper, the unmistakable look of a king preparing to defend what he had already decided was under his protection. "He may know you crossed into my territory," Cale said, his voice steady despite the tension now filling the hall. "But he does not command here. I do." He turned toward the guard, his tone leaving no room for argument. "Tell the riders the Alpha King will meet with their leader personally, alone, and ensure Miss Ashwood remains well guarded and out of sight until I return." As the guard departed to relay the king's message, Lyra stood frozen in the center of the grand hall, her heart pounding with a terror she had hoped to leave behind at her old pack's border, now suddenly, impossibly close once again. Draven had found her. And whatever answers waited buried within Cale's ancient records, whatever connection tied her family's quiet, modest history to the powerful Thornbrook line, she now understood with sudden, chilling clarity that she would need every ounce of protection this unfamiliar king was willing to offer, because the man who had once claimed to love her had clearly not given up on claiming her inheritance, no matter how far she had run to escape him. Cale walked toward the northern border with measured, unhurried steps, though inside, his mind moved far faster than his calm exterior suggested. He had ruled the Thornbrook lands for nearly 6 years, inheriting the position from his father far earlier than expected, and in that time, he had learned to mask uncertainty behind steady composure. Today, that skill would prove essential. He found Draven waiting exactly where the guards had described, standing at the edge of the border marker with 4 other pack members positioned behind him, their postures alert but not overtly hostile. Draven himself appeared calm, even friendly, his expression carefully arranged into one of polite concern rather than the desperate hunger Cale suspected lay beneath the surface. "Alpha King," Draven said, offering a respectful bow. "Thank you for meeting with me personally. I apologize for the intrusion, but I fear a member of my pack may have wandered lost into your territory. A young woman, recently grieving the loss of her father. I am deeply concerned for her safety and well-being." Cale studied him carefully, noting the practiced ease with which the lie slipped from his mouth, the concern that did not quite reach his eyes. He had met men like this before, ambitious enforcers, who mistook charm for genuine character, who believed authority could be won through manipulation rather than earned through integrity. "Her name?" Cale asked, keeping his tone neutral. "Lyra Ashwood," Draven answered without hesitation. "She is my mate. She has been struggling greatly since her father's passing, and I fear grief may have clouded her judgment. I only wish to bring her home safely, where she belongs." The word mate settled uncomfortably in Cale's chest, though he kept his expression carefully unreadable. He thought of the fear he had witnessed in Lyra's eyes only moments before, the genuine terror that had drained the color from her face at the mere mention of this man's name. Whatever bond existed between them, it clearly did not carry the warmth or safety a mate bond was meant to provide. "I am aware of a young woman matching that description, resting within my territory," Cale said carefully. "She arrived here in poor condition, exhausted and injured, after several days without proper food or shelter." Relief flickered across Draven's face, quickly masked, but not quickly enough to escape Cale's careful observation. "Then she is safe. I am deeply grateful for your assistance, Alpha King. If you would allow us to collect her, we will return home immediately and trouble your territory no further." "That will not be possible," Cale said simply. Draven's expression flickered, the polite mask slipping for just a moment, before he quickly recovered his composure. "I do not understand. She is my mate. Pack law across every territory recognizes a mate's right to reclaim a member who has wandered from their protection." "Pack law also recognizes sanctuary rights," Cale replied evenly, "particularly when the individual in question has expressed clear and credible fear for her safety should she return. Miss Ashwood has requested protection within my territory. Until I have personally investigated the circumstances surrounding her departure from your pack, she will remain under my protection." Anger flashed briefly across Draven's face before he forced it back down, his jaw tightening visibly despite his attempt to maintain a calm exterior. "With respect, Alpha King, this is a private pack matter. Her father recently passed, and grief has clearly affected her judgment. I only wish to bring her home and ensure she receives proper care during this difficult time. Then you will not object to my thorough investigation of her claims before any decisions are made regarding her return," Cale said, his voice hardening slightly, despite his continued outward calm. "If your intentions are as pure as you describe, you have nothing to fear from a brief delay." For a moment, something dangerous flickered behind Draven's eyes, a glimpse of the calculating hunger Lyra had described, quickly hidden once more beneath practiced composure. "Of course," he said finally, his tone carefully controlled. "I understand your caution, Alpha King. I will await your decision. However, I hope you understand that prolonged separation from her pack and her mate bond may cause her further distress. It would be cruel to keep her isolated from those who care for her well-being." "I assure you," Cale said, his tone leaving no room for further argument, "her well-being is precisely my concern." Draven bowed once more, though his eyes carried a coldness that had not been present at the beginning of their conversation. "Then I will return to my territory and await word. Please send message the moment your investigation concludes." As Draven and his companions turned to depart, Cale remained standing at the border for several long moments, watching until they disappeared entirely from view, his mind already working through the implications of what he had just witnessed. Everything about Draven's demeanor, the practiced concern that failed to mask genuine calculation beneath it, confirmed exactly what Lyra had described. This was not a man mourning the loss of his mate. This was a man frustrated that his prey had slipped beyond his immediate reach. He returned to the stronghold with purposeful strides, his thoughts already shifting toward the records he needed to review, the questions that needed answers, before he could properly understand the full scope of what Lyra Ashwood's arrival truly meant for his territory, and potentially for the entire balance of power among the northern packs. He found Merrin waiting near the entrance to his private study, her expression carrying the particular tension she always displayed when something significant demanded his attention. "How is she?" Cale asked immediately. "Resting, though anxious," Merrin answered. "She heard about the riders at the border and has been unable to settle since. I assured her you would return with news, but I think she fears the worst regardless of what you might say." Cale nodded, understanding the fear all too well. "I will speak with her shortly. First, I need you to retrieve the old family records, specifically anything relating to territorial agreements and bloodline registries from 3 generations past. Look for any mention of the name Ashwood." Merrin's eyebrows rose slightly at the request, though years of service had taught her not to question the king's instructions without good reason. I will begin the search immediately. May I ask what you suspect? Cale hesitated, gathering his thoughts before answering. I am not entirely certain yet, but her father's name struck something in my memory, something tied to stories my own father once told me. Stories I always assumed were simply old legends passed down without real substance. If I am right, however, this goes far beyond a single woman's inheritance dispute. It touches something that concerns the founding history of this entire territory, and possibly the true source of power, tied to certain lands long considered simply valuable, rather than truly significant. Marin studied him carefully, her expression thoughtful. You believe she may be connected to the old bloodline stories, the ones your grandmother used to speak of. I believe it is possible, Cale admitted. And if it is true, then the danger she is running from is not simply about greed or territorial ambition. It is about something far older and far more dangerous than either of us has yet fully understood. As Marin departed to begin her search through the ancient records, Cale made his way toward the room where Lyra rested, his mind heavy with questions that would soon demand answers neither of them was fully prepared to face. He thought of the fear in her eyes when she had spoken Draven's name, the exhaustion evident in every line of her posture despite her attempts to appear composed and strong. Whatever connection existed between her family and his own ancient bloodline, whatever secret her father had died protecting, Cale found himself determined, with a conviction that surprised him given how recently they had met, to ensure that Lyra Ashwood survived long enough to learn the truth for herself. The window Draven had spoken of, the thinning veil that would soon open, meant time was growing shorter with each passing day. Whatever answers waited buried within his family's ancient records, Cale understood with growing certainty that he needed to find them quickly, before the season turned, and before the dangerous, hungry ambition driving Draven Cole found another opportunity to finish what he had started. 3 days passed following Draven's visit to the northern border, and with each one, Lyra felt the strange, unfamiliar sensation of tension slowly beginning to loosen its grip on her chest, replaced by a cautious, uncertain hope she had not allowed herself to feel since her father's death. Cale had kept his word. No further attempts had been made to remove her from Thornbrook territory, and though guards remained stationed discreetly near her quarters, their presence felt protective rather than confining. She spent those days recovering her strength under Marin's careful supervision, eating proper meals for the first time in what felt like ages, sleeping through full nights without the constant fear of discovery jolting her awake. Slowly, color returned to her cheeks, and the trembling weakness that had plagued her limbs since her arrival began to fade into something closer to her former self. Yet despite the physical recovery, questions continued to gnaw at her thoughts constantly. What connection could possibly exist between her quiet, unremarkable family and the ancient, powerful Thornbrook line? Why had Cale's expression shifted so dramatically the moment she mentioned her father's name? And what exactly had her father meant in those final, hurried journal entries about power hidden beneath their land and warnings too dangerous to share, even with his own pack council? On the 4th day, a young messenger arrived at her quarters requesting her presence in the king's private study, a request that sent both hope and nervous anticipation twisting through her stomach in equal measure. She followed the messenger through corridors she was slowly beginning to recognize, her heart quickening with each step closer to whatever answers waited ahead. She found Cale seated behind a large wooden desk covered in aged documents, scrolls, and what appeared to be an old, leather-bound family registry open to a page marked with a faded ribbon. Marin stood nearby, her expression carrying the same tension Lyra had noticed on Cale's face the day the riders arrived at the border. "Please sit," Cale said, gesturing toward a chair positioned across from his desk. His voice carried a gravity that immediately heightened Lyra's nervous anticipation. She sat carefully, folding her hands in her lap to hide their slight trembling. "You found something." "We did," Cale confirmed, exchanging a brief glance with Marin before continuing. "Though I must warn you, what we discovered raises as many questions as it answers, and some of what I am about to tell you may be difficult to hear." Lyra nodded, steeling herself. "I have spent weeks running from lies and half-truths. I would rather face difficult truth than continue living in uncertainty." Cale studied her for a long moment, something like respect flickering across his expression before he continued. Nearly 60 years ago, before either of us was born, my grandfather ruled these lands. During that time, an alliance was formed between our family and another bloodline, one considered among the oldest and most powerful in the Northern Territories, tied directly to the earliest founding pacts and the ancient magic believed to run through certain sacred lands. He turned the old registry toward her, revealing a page filled with careful, faded handwriting listing names and dates Lyra did not immediately recognize. This alliance, Cale continued, was meant to be sealed through a promised bond between the two bloodlines, my grandfather's youngest sister and the heir of that other family. However, before the bond could be formally completed, war broke out between several rival territories. The other bloodline, fearing for the safety of their heir and the sacred land they protected, chose to disappear entirely, hiding their identity and their true lineage to protect their bloodline from those who sought to claim their power through force rather than proper alliance. Lyra's breath caught in her throat. You believe my father was connected to this family? Cale nodded slowly. The registry lists the hidden bloodline's family name before they disappeared, Ashwood. The room seemed to tilt slightly around her, Lyra's mind struggling to process the implications of what she had just heard. That cannot be right. My father was simply a beta, a respected one, but nothing more. If my family truly carried this kind of significance, surely he would have told me. Surely someone within our pack would have known. Perhaps that was precisely the point, Marin interjected gently. If your ancestors fled specifically to protect their bloodline from those seeking to exploit its connection to sacred land, it would make sense that subsequent generations were raised in careful secrecy, perhaps not even fully aware themselves of the true scope of their heritage, until circumstances forced the truth to the surface. Lyra thought immediately of her father's journal, of his cryptic warnings about the land holding more than soil, about a pull he felt beneath his feet that he could not fully explain. My father wrote about feeling something beneath the western borderland, she said slowly. He seemed to suspect something significant, though he never fully understood what it meant either. That aligns with what the registry suggests, Cale said. The sacred land tied to your bloodline was never lost, merely hidden, protected quietly by your family for generations, without full understanding of its true nature or history. The western borderland you inherited is very likely the same land my grandfather's records describe, the location where the ley line described in the oldest founding stories runs strongest. And Draven knew this, Lyra whispered, pieces slowly clicking into place with sickening clarity. Or at least, he and Corwin suspected enough to understand its value, even without knowing the full history behind it. It appears so, Cale confirmed grimly. Ancient magic tied to sacred bloodlines carries power that extends far beyond simple territorial value. If the old stories hold any truth, whoever holds that land, and whoever carries that bloodline, when the veil between the physical world and the deeper magic grows thin during this season, could gain influence over far more than a single pack's borders. Draven likely intended to use your death, combined with his claim as your surviving mate, to seize both the land and whatever power might be unlocked through it. Lyra sat in stunned silence, the weight of everything she had just learned settling heavily across her shoulders. Her quiet, unremarkable life, the simple existence she had always known as a beta's daughter, had apparently been built atop secrets far larger and more dangerous than she could have ever imagined. Her father's careful protectiveness, his refusal to sell the western land despite lucrative offers, his cryptic journal warnings, all of it finally made sense within this new, staggering context. Why did you help me? She asked finally, her voice quiet but steady, despite the storm of emotions churning within her. Before you knew any of this, before you understood the connection to your own family's history, you could have simply turned me away, or handed me back to Draven without complication. Why risk conflict with another pack for a stranger you had never met? Cale's expression softened slightly, though the seriousness in his eyes remained. Because even before I suspected any connection to my family's ancient alliance, I recognized genuine fear in your eyes when you spoke of Draven, a fear no woman should ever carry toward someone claiming to love her. Whatever ancient history exists between our bloodlines, my decision to offer you sanctuary was made simply because it was the right thing to do. not because of any prophecy or old registry. Something warm and unfamiliar stirred in Lyra's chest at his words, a feeling she did not yet have the emotional strength to fully examine, given everything else she had just learned. She pushed the sensation aside, forcing her focus back toward the more immediate, pressing concerns now facing her. "What happens now?" she asked. "If Draven and Corwin understand even a fraction of what you have just told me, they will not simply give up. They will continue searching for a way to claim that land, and whatever power it holds, especially with the season's window closing soon." Cale's expression hardened with grim determination. "Then we ensure they do not succeed. You are no longer facing this threat alone, Lyra. Whatever ancient alliance once existed between our bloodlines, whatever obligation history has placed upon my family regarding yours, I intend to honor it fully. You will have my protection, and the full strength of Thornbrook territory standing behind you, for as long as this threat against you remains." Lyra looked up at him, searching his steady, determined gaze for any sign of the calculating ambition she had once mistaken for love in Draven's eyes. She found none, only quiet resolve, and something else she could not quite name, something that made her chest tighten with a feeling far different from the fear that had defined her recent days. For the first time since fleeing her home 11 days earlier, Lyra allowed herself to believe, cautiously but genuinely, that she might not simply survive this impossible situation, but eventually find her way through it entirely, guided by allies whose strength and integrity stood in stark, welcome contrast to the betrayal that had forced her to run in the first place. News of Draven's visit to the northern border did not stay contained within Thornbrook territory for long. Within days, whispers began spreading among neighboring packs, carried by traveling merchants and messengers who moved between territories, exchanging goods and gossip in equal measure. By the end of the week, Cale's council found itself facing formal inquiries from several allied packs, all curious why the Alpha King had personally intervened in what appeared, on the surface, to be a simple domestic dispute between mates. Cale called his full council together to address the growing concern, gathering his most trusted advisors within the same great hall where Lyra had first met him. Lyra herself sat quietly near the back of the room at Cale's insistence, present, but not yet required to speak, observing as the council debated the increasingly complicated situation unfolding around her. "With respect, Alpha King," one older councilman said carefully, "sheltering another pack's mate, regardless of her claims against him, risks significant political tension. If Draven Cole formally petitions the regional council for her return, we may find ourselves facing consequences that extend beyond a simple territorial dispute." "I am aware of the risks," Cale answered evenly. "However, I believe the situation extends far beyond a simple mate dispute. Evidence suggests Miss Ashwood's life is in genuine danger, and further evidence suggests a connection between her bloodline and matters of significant historical importance to this territory specifically." Murmurs rippled through the assembled council members at this revelation, several exchanging surprised glances. Cale proceeded to explain, in careful, measured terms, the connection uncovered within the ancient family registry, watching as understanding slowly dawned across the faces of his most trusted advisors. "If this is true," another councilman said slowly, "then protecting her is not simply a matter of honor or kindness. It becomes a matter tied directly to obligations our own bloodline holds from generations past." "Precisely," Cale confirmed. "Which is why I intend to formally extend full sanctuary status to Miss Ashwood, recognized and binding under our territory's oldest laws, ensuring no outside pack, including her former one, holds any legal authority to remove her from this territory against her will." The council debated the formal declaration for nearly an hour, weighing political implications against the moral and historical obligations Cale had presented. Eventually, after careful discussion, the council reached agreement, granting Lyra formal sanctuary status, a protection that, while not entirely eliminating outside political pressure, provided significant legal grounding for Cale's continued protection of her. As the council meeting concluded and members began filing out of the hall, Lyra approached Cale, gratitude and lingering uncertainty warring within her expression. "Thank you," she said quietly, "for standing behind me so completely, even against your own council's hesitation." "You do not need to thank me," Cale said, though something in his tone suggested her words affected him more deeply than he outwardly showed. "You have done nothing wrong, Lyra. The only person who should carry guilt in this situation is the man who betrayed the trust you placed in him." Before Lyra could respond further, a guard entered the hall, urgency evident in his rushed steps. "Alpha King, a formal delegation has arrived at our border. Beta Corwin, representing the Ashwood Pack Council, requests immediate audience regarding the matter of Miss Ashwood's continued residence within your territory." Cale's expression hardened instantly, though he nodded calmly toward the guard. "Bring them to the hall. I will meet with them personally." "Should I remain?" Lyra asked, her heart quickening with familiar anxiety at the mention of Corwin's name. "Yes," Cale said firmly. "You have every right to be present when decisions regarding your own safety are being discussed. You will not hide as though you have done something wrong, not while I stand beside you." Corwin arrived 20 minutes later, accompanied by 2 other pack officials, though notably without Draven himself present. His expression carried practiced diplomacy as he offered a formal bow toward Cale, his sharp eyes flickering briefly, calculatingly, toward Lyra before returning to the king. "Alpha King, thank you for granting us audience," Corwin began smoothly. "We come representing the Ashwood Pack Council's formal concern regarding Miss Ashwood's continued absence from her home territory. Her mate, Draven Cole, has expressed deep worry for her well-being, and the council wishes to understand the circumstances that have led her to remain within your protection, rather than returning home. Miss Ashwood has formally requested and received sanctuary status within my territory," Cale answered evenly, "based on credible evidence suggesting genuine danger to her life should she return to your pack's protection." Corwin's expression flickered with carefully controlled surprise, though Lyra noticed a subtle tension entering his posture that had not been present moments before. "Danger? Alpha King, I assure you, this is simply a misunderstanding born from grief and emotional distress, following her father's recent passing. There is no genuine threat against Miss Ashwood within our pack." "Then you will not object," Cale said, his tone carrying an edge of quiet challenge, "to a formal, independent investigation into the circumstances surrounding her departure, conducted jointly by representatives from both our territories, to properly clarify the truth of the matter." Something dangerous flashed briefly across Corwin's carefully composed expression before he managed to mask it once more. "Of course," he said, though his voice carried noticeably less confidence than before. "Our pack has nothing to hide." "Then we are in agreement," Cale said. "I will send representatives to your territory within the week to conduct interviews and review relevant records. Until that investigation concludes, Miss Ashwood will remain under my protection, as sanctuary law within these lands clearly permits." Corwin's jaw tightened visibly, though he offered another formal bow, understanding clearly that further argument in this moment would gain him nothing but additional suspicion. "As you wish, Alpha King. We look forward to resolving this matter quickly and returning Miss Ashwood safely home." As Corwin and his companions departed, Lyra released a breath she had not realized she was holding, her hands trembling slightly despite her efforts to remain composed. "He knows," she said quietly, once the hall had emptied of outside visitors. "He knows we suspect the truth." "Did you see his expression when you mentioned the investigation?" "I did," Cale confirmed grimly. "Which means we should expect them to move more quickly now, rather than waiting patiently for a formal investigation that might expose their plans. Draven and Corwin understand that time is working against them, both in terms of the closing seasonal window and in terms of growing suspicions surrounding their intentions." "What do we do?" Lyra asked, fear mixing with a new, steadier resolve that had not been present in her voice during her earliest days within Thornbrook territory. Cale studied her for a long moment, something like quiet pride flickering behind his serious expression at the strength she had shown throughout this impossible ordeal. "We prepare," he said firmly. "We continue gathering evidence, strengthen your position through the investigation, and ensure that when Draven and Corwin inevitably attempt something more direct, we are ready to meet that threat head-on, rather than simply reacting to it after the fact." Lyra nodded, steadying herself with a deep breath. The frightened, exhausted woman who had collapsed at Cale's border weeks earlier felt increasingly distant now, replaced by someone who, while still afraid, refused any longer to simply run and hide from the danger pursuing her. She had spent her entire life believing herself to be nothing more than a quiet beta's daughter, unremarkable and unimportant beyond her small role within her pack. Now standing within the grand hall of an ancient, powerful territory, protected by a king whose own bloodline history was tied inexplicably to her own, she began to understand that perhaps she had never truly known her own worth, or the strength quietly waiting within her all along. Whatever confrontation lay ahead, whatever final desperate move Draven and Corwin attempted as their window of opportunity continued closing, Lyra found herself determined, for the first time since her father's death, to face that confrontation not as a frightened victim running for her life, but as someone finally ready to reclaim control over her own destiny. The investigation team Cale dispatched to the Ashwood territory returned 9 days later, carrying with them evidence far more damning than even Lyra had anticipated. Careful interviews with pack members who had grown increasingly uncomfortable with Corwin's tightening influence revealed a pattern of manipulation stretching back months before her father's death. Small, but significant decisions steered quietly in directions that consistently benefited Corwin and Draven's growing ambitions. More damning still, one of the investigators had located the mysterious woman Lyra had seen speaking with Draven near the boundary markers, a traveling practitioner of old magic who, once separated from Draven's protection and faced with formal questioning, had revealed extensive details about the ritual Draven intended to perform. Her testimony confirmed everything Lyra had overheard, along with disturbing new details about how far Draven and Corwin had been willing to go to ensure the ritual's success. "There is something else," the lead investigator said carefully, once he had finished presenting the primary findings to Cale and Lyra within the private study. "Something concerning your father's death, Miss Ashwood." Lyra's stomach tightened with sudden dread. "What do you mean?" The investigator hesitated, glancing briefly toward Cale before continuing. "Several pack members mentioned that your father had grown notably anxious in the weeks before his passing, expressing concerns to close friends about Corwin's increasing influence within the council, and about strange visitors who had begun appearing near the western boundary. One friend recalled your father mentioning he intended to formally raise these concerns before the full council, just days before his heart failure." "Are you suggesting," Lyra said slowly, horror creeping through her chest, "that my father's death was not natural?" "I cannot confirm that with certainty," the investigator admitted carefully. "Your father's healer maintains his death resulted from natural heart failure, consistent with his age and the physical demands of his position. However, given everything else we have uncovered regarding Corwin and Draven's activities, the timing raises questions that deserve further examination." Lyra sat in stunned silence, processing this devastating new possibility. Her father's death, which she had spent weeks grieving as a tragic but natural loss, might instead have been the very first move in Draven and Corwin's calculated plan to seize control of her family's land and its hidden power. The thought settled like ice through her veins, transforming her grief into something sharper, more furious. "We may never have definitive proof regarding your father's passing," Cale said gently, noticing the way her hands had begun trembling despite her attempt at composure. "But we now have more than sufficient evidence regarding Draven's intentions toward you directly, along with clear evidence of Corwin's manipulation within your pack's council. This is enough to bring formal charges before the regional council, charges serious enough to permanently strip both men of any standing or authority." "I want justice," Lyra said, her voice steady despite the storm of emotion churning beneath the surface. "Not just protection for myself, but justice for my father, and for every pack member Corwin has manipulated and endangered through his ambition." "Then we will pursue exactly that," Cale confirmed firmly. The formal hearing before the regional council was scheduled for 1 week later, held within neutral territory, to ensure fairness for all parties involved. Lyra spent that week preparing carefully alongside Cale and his advisors, reviewing every piece of evidence, practicing her testimony, steadying herself for the confrontation that would finally bring everything into the open, before witnesses powerful enough to render lasting judgment. The day of the hearing arrived cold and clear, the neutral council hall filled with representatives from numerous packs across the region, all drawn by the growing rumors surrounding the unusual case. Lyra stood before the assembled council, with Chaol positioned steadily beside her, drawing strength from his quiet, unwavering presence as she prepared to face Draven and Corwin publicly for the first time since her escape. Draven's expression, when she finally saw him again, carried none of the warmth she remembered from their earlier years together. His eyes were cold, calculating, filled with barely restrained anger at finding himself publicly exposed, rather than quietly claiming what he had believed was rightfully his. Corwin stood beside him, his composed facade finally cracking under the weight of mounting evidence he could no longer easily dismiss. The hearing stretched across several difficult hours. Witness testimony laid out methodically before the assembled council, each piece of evidence building steadily toward an undeniable conclusion. Lyra herself testified clearly and steadily, describing the conversation she had overheard, the strange woman near the boundary markers, the growing unease she had felt long before finally understanding the full scope of Draven's betrayal. When Draven finally rose to offer his own defense, his carefully constructed explanations crumbled quickly under the council's sharp questioning, each attempt to explain away the mounting evidence only revealing further inconsistencies in his account. Corwin's attempts to distance himself from Draven's actions similarly collapsed once witnesses confirmed his direct involvement in planning the ritual and manipulating council decisions for months prior to Lyra's father's death. By the time the council retired to deliberate, the outcome felt almost inevitable, though Lyra still found herself holding her breath through the tense wait that followed. When the council finally returned, their verdict rang clearly through the silent hall. Draven Cole and Corwin were found guilty of conspiracy against a fellow pack member, attempted murder, and manipulation of pack governance for personal gain. Both men were stripped immediately of all rank and authority, permanently banished from Ashwood territory, and formally barred from ever holding leadership position within any recognized pack across the region. The mate bond between Lyra and Draven, given the clear evidence of his betrayal and murderous intent, was formally and permanently severed by council decree, freeing her completely from any remaining claim he might have attempted regarding her inheritance. As the verdict was announced, Lyra felt something powerful shift within her chest, a heavy weight lifting that she had carried since the moment she first overheard Draven's plotting weeks earlier. She was free, truly, completely free, no longer running, no longer hiding, no longer trapped beneath the shadow of a betrayal that had once threatened to define the rest of her life. Draven's expression, as guards moved to escort him from the hall, carried a final, desperate fury directed squarely at her, though he said nothing further, understanding perhaps that any additional words would only worsen his already ruined standing. Lyra met his gaze steadily, refusing to look away, refusing to allow even a flicker of the old fear to show upon her face. She had survived his betrayal. She had survived the river, the exhausting flight through unfamiliar forests, the terrifying uncertainty of trusting strangers with her life. She would not allow his final, hateful glance to diminish the strength she had fought so hard to reclaim. As the hall slowly emptied following the hearing's conclusion, Chaol moved to stand beside her, his presence steady and reassuring as always. "It is finished," he said quietly. "Whatever danger Draven and Corwin represented, they no longer hold any power to threaten you or your inheritance." Lyra turned to face him, gratitude, and something warmer, something she had been carefully avoiding, fully acknowledging throughout their weeks together, rising clearly to the surface. "I could not have survived this without you," she said honestly. "Without your protection, your belief in me when I had nothing but accusations and fear to offer as proof. You survived this because of your own strength," Chaol corrected gently. "I simply ensured you had a safe place to stand while you found it." For a long moment, they simply stood together in the quiet aftermath of the hearing, the weight of justice finally served, settling comfortably between them. Lyra understood, standing there beside the king whose unexpected kindness had saved her life, and whose family's ancient history remained mysteriously intertwined with her own, that whatever came next in her life, she would not be facing it alone. In the weeks following the hearing, Lyra returned briefly to her former territory, this time not as a frightened fugitive slipping away under cover of darkness, but as a free woman, escorted respectfully by representatives from Thornbrook territory, there to formally reclaim her inheritance and help guide her old pack through the difficult process of rebuilding trust after months of quiet manipulation under Corwin's influence. The pack she returned to felt different from the one she had fled, though the physical surroundings remained largely unchanged. Familiar faces greeted her with a mixture of relief and quiet shame, many admitting they had sensed something wrong within the council's decisions in recent months, but had lacked the courage or evidence to challenge Corwin's authority directly. Lyra found herself, somewhat unexpectedly, extending grace rather than resentment toward those who had failed to see the danger she had faced, understanding that fear and uncertainty could cloud judgment even among well-meaning people. She visited her father's grave for the first time since the funeral, kneeling quietly beside the simple stone marker while the autumn wind moved gently through the surrounding trees. She spoke to him softly, telling him everything that had happened since his passing, the betrayal she had uncovered, the truth about their family's hidden history, the unexpected kindness and protection she had found within Thornbrook territory. "You tried to warn me," she whispered, tracing her fingers gently across the carved letters of his name. "I only wish I had understood your warnings sooner. But I found my way through it, Father. I found people I can trust. I think, somehow, you would have approved." The western borderland, once the source of so much danger and betrayal, took on new meaning as Lyra walked its quiet paths for the first time with genuine understanding of its significance. She could not yet fully sense the ancient power her father's journal had described, the strange pull he had written about feeling beneath his feet, but standing among the old, deeply rooted trees marking her family's ancestral land, she felt something quietly reassuring nonetheless, a sense of belonging and purpose that had been entirely absent from her life since her father's death. Rather than simply returning to her previous quiet existence, Lyra made the decision to formally establish careful, protected stewardship over the western borderland, working alongside scholars from Thornbrook territory to properly understand the ancient magic tied to her bloodline, ensuring that whatever power the land held would never again become a target for those seeking to exploit it through violence and betrayal. She also made the decision, after careful consideration, to step back from immediate leadership responsibilities within her former pack, instead helping guide the selection of a new, trustworthy beta before returning to Thornbrook territory, where Chaol had made clear, without pressure or expectation, that she would always be welcome. The bond that had slowly grown between them throughout the difficult weeks of her ordeal had shifted, by the time she returned to Thornbrook lands, into something neither of them fully spoke aloud, but both clearly understood. It was nothing like the sudden, overwhelming pull she had once felt toward Draven, the instant spark that had ultimately proven hollow and false. What grew between Lyra and Chaol instead developed slowly, built carefully upon genuine trust, mutual respect, and the quiet strength they had both shown throughout weeks of uncertainty and danger. On a clear evening several months after the formal hearing, Lyra found herself standing once again within the grand hall where she had first met Chaol, though everything about the moment felt entirely different now. The fear and uncertainty that had once defined her presence within these walls had been replaced entirely by comfort and quiet belonging. "You seem thoughtful this evening," Chaol said, joining her near the tall windows overlooking the territory's peaceful, moonlit forests. "I was thinking about everything that led me here," Lyra admitted, turning to face him. "How strange it is that the worst betrayal of my life ultimately led me toward discovering not just the truth about my family's history, but toward people, toward a life that feels more genuine than anything I believed I had before." Chaol studied her carefully, something warm and unmistakably affectionate softening his usually composed expression. "Do you regret any of it? The running, the fear, everything you were forced to endure?" "I regret the pain," Lyra said honestly. "I regret that my father's death may not have been as natural as I once believed, and I regret every moment of fear Draven's betrayal caused me. But I do not regret where that path ultimately led." She paused, meeting his eyes steadily. "I do not regret finding you." Something shifted between them in that quiet moment, the careful distance they had both maintained throughout months of respectful friendship, finally dissolving into an honesty neither had fully permitted themselves to express before. Chaol reached for her hand gently, his touch entirely different from anything she had once felt with Draven, warm and steady rather than calculated, genuine rather than performed. "I did not expect," The day my guards brought an unconscious stranger through my gates, that she would come to mean as much to me as you have, Lyra, Cale said quietly. But I find myself deeply grateful for whatever path led you to my border that night, despite the danger and pain that preceded it. As am I, Lyra whispered, allowing herself fully, for the first time since her father's death, to embrace the possibility of genuine happiness rather than simply survival. In the months that followed, the ancient alliance once broken by war and fear generations earlier was formally renewed between the Ashwood and Thornbrook bloodlines, sealed not through forced obligation or political necessity, but through a bond built genuinely upon trust, respect, and mutual understanding, earned through shared hardship and unwavering loyalty. Lyra Ashwood, once a quiet Beta's daughter who had never imagined herself significant beyond her small role within an unremarkable pack, emerged from her ordeal transformed entirely, no longer defined by fear or betrayal, but by the quiet strength and resilience that had carried her through impossible circumstances, toward a life and a love, far more genuine than anything she had once believed herself worthy of claiming. The western borderland, once nearly the cause of her death, became instead a symbol of everything she had overcome, carefully protected, deeply respected, and finally, after generations of secrecy and fear, allowed to exist openly as the sacred, ancient inheritance her family had always been meant to carry proudly, rather than hide in quiet desperation. And as the seasons continued turning, marking the slow passage of time since that terrifying night she first fled into the darkness alone, Lyra found herself, at last, exactly where she was always meant to be, safe, strong, and surrounded by people who valued her, not for the power or land she carried, but simply for the person she had always been, even before she fully understood her own worth.